Instead, he accepted a lift from a Swiss after all. He had left Basel along the road that was signposted to Germany. The great lofty snow-capped peaks had been left behind now, and the mountains had become round and green and high. But the countryside was still beautiful, and David liked the look of the houses. They were quite different to those in Italy. They were not as pretty, but they were very, very clean. They looked very beautiful with their window boxes full of flowers. Then he found himself at another frontier point. There were police about, but there were only a couple of them, and they were busily occupied examining a man's papers, a tall man from Switzerland driving a big car. So David turned off the narrow road, and when he was out of sight, he ran up the hillside and back to the road on the other side of the barrier, into Germany. But he had not been walking above a minute or two when a car pulled up in front of him, the one he'd seen at the frontier post. David was frightened. He had not looked at the man closely. Perhaps he was one of them. What else should he have stopped? King seemed to sense his fear. The dog placed himself in front of him and growled at the man. "Well, my little vagabond, you slipped across that frontier pretty nimbly, eh?" King stopped growling, and David looked up quickly into the man's face. You could hardly say he looked as if he were in the habit of laughing. On the contrary, he looked worried and depressed, but kind and friendly too. Perhaps it was because his face was lined in a peculiar way that he looked so sad. "Yes," said David. What else could he say? "Where are you going to, then?" "Brunswick." "Well, I'm not going as far as that, but I can give you a lift to Frankfurt if your dog can behave himself." David thanked him, and he said that he thought King would sit still, but he didn't know for sure, and the Swiss smiled and said he was honest at any rate. David felt uncomfortable. That was the worst part of it. He wanted to be honest, but he was always driven to telling lies. People questioned him, and then he had to fall back upon the story he'd invented. The only point he was quite frank about was his name, for he was David, and that was something he would always stand by. The Swiss was called Graf, and David hated telling him all about the circus and being taken ill in Naples. It was against his grain to lie to someone who seemed so kind and gentle. David thought the food the man gave him quite delicious. King got him something to eat too, and when they reached Frankfurt, it would have taken David a good many days to do the journey on foot. The man gave David some money, 5 of the coins they used in Germany. Marks, they were called. "I'm not sure if you're a little rascal," the man said, "but you've got a clear look in your eye and your dog loves you, so you must be a good boy, whatever you are. You haven't run away from your parents, have you? The truth, David?" David looked at him straight in the face. "No, I haven't run away from my parents. That's the truth. And thank you for giving me and my dog food and for driving us such a long way." The Swiss stood watching him until he reached the corner of the street, and then he raised his hand and waved to him. Hesitantly, David raised his own and waved back, somewhat awkwardly, for he'd never waved to anyone before. During the days that followed, David got several lifts, and King learned to lie peacefully between David's feet, and so no one could accuse him of being restless. People were always nervous of him at first, because he often looked like he would bite, because he was very big. But when they saw how meekly he did everything David told him to, they would laugh and call him a sheep in wolf's clothing. For David always spoke very quietly and politely to him, in a way that they obviously did not think it possible to talk to a dog. But David did not care. King had chosen to go with him, and he was not going to show ingratitude by ordering him about. David hated orders himself and loud commanding voices, and as long as he was with him, King should remain a free dog. He was a clever dog too. David had heard people say a dog was as clever as a human being, but that, he thought, was nonsense. A dog was a dog, and a man was a man, and you can't be as clever as something quite different. But a dog could certainly be clever in a doggy sort of way, and King was clever and good. Everything had been fine since he gave the farmer the slip and the dog joined him. There'd been times, of course, when he'd been hungry and he felt the cold, but nothing had ever happened to frighten him, and he'd not seen anyone who looked like them. He knew where he was going. It was comforting to have the dog with him. He wouldn't carry on a conversation with it, naturally, but it was good to know it was there, keeping him warm at night and always ready to protect him. David knew he couldn't rely too much on the dog's protection, for though it could bite, it could not get the better of a man, not one of them at any rate. They always went armed, but it was a comfort just to know it wanted to. David was to learn his mistake. Perhaps Perhaps it happened because he was in too much of a hurry. He was able to plan his route from the maps he found on railway stations, and he had become quite good at working out how long a particular stretch of the journey would take if he got a lift or if he had to walk. He knew that it wouldn't take him many days now to reach Denmark. Perhaps it happened too because the hours at a time he would almost forget his fears now. He had had fear too well drilled into him ever to be completely free of it. But he was not so bad now, for the man really intended him to get to Denmark. There had been no trap, and the children's parents had not given him away either. There was only the farmer, and David thought he was too stupid to imagine David might have run away from them. They must be still looking for him, of course. The man's influence was limited, but he would not have been able to prevent it. But no one knew where to look for him, and now Denmark was almost within reach. Denmark and the woman who was his mother. He must have been walking for half an hour before he was suddenly aware of his fear, and he knew that he should have sensed danger earlier. It was dusk, and he had been too preoccupied with finding a good place to sleep. Something was wrong. The building further down the hillside, and the man standing outside it. He called to King softly in a whisper. He had returned to them. He lay as still as death behind the bush. It was fortunate King always did he was told, and was now lying perfectly still by his side. How had it happened? There was no doubt about it. He was back among them. David knew the signs only too well. He was only too familiar with the way they looked. It must have happened when the dog ran off over the fields. David would sometimes play with the dog, and it would run off with a stone or a stick in its mouth, intending David to chase it. David thought it was rather pointless, really, and not very amusing, but the dog liked it, and so David would join in to please it. But he ought to have known something was wrong as soon as they'd got back to the road. The three people they'd met on their way should have aroused his suspicions. People always looked like that when they were, like prisoners in a concentration camp, weary, grey-faced, apprehensive, dejected and sorrowful, as though they'd forgotten life could be good, as if they no longer thought about anything. The dog looked at him questioningly and began quietly whimpering. David placed his hand over his muzzle and it stopped, but it continued to look at him. The bush was too thin, its new green leaves too small. David thought quite how beautiful he'd thought spring was only that morning, with its small, new, bright green leaves. His one thought was now that you could look through the bush and see him lying on the ground, and he was David, a boy who'd fled from them. In their barracks they would have had a list of everyone who was under suspicion and should be arrested on sight. Their guards always had a list like that. On that list would be found David, a thin boy with brown hair, escaped from concentration camp. And under the heading Recognition Marks would be, it is obvious from the appearance of his eyes that he is not an ordinary boy, but only a prisoner. If the men had not been talking so loudly, they would have heard him already. They were much too close to him, and he would never be able to get away. Even if he waited until it was quite dark, they would hear him as soon as he moved. His flight would end where it began, at the point of a rifle. For he would not stop when they shouted to him. If he stopped, they would not shoot, but they would interrogate him instead and send him back to the camp. And there, strong and healthy as he was, he would be in a terribly long time dying. No, when they called to him, he would run, and then the shot would be fired which had been waiting for him ever since the night when he'd walked calmly towards the tree on the way to the mine outside the camp. But this time he would not be able to walk calmly away from them. He now knew how wonderful life could be, and his desire to live would spur him on. He would run, and he knew it, and it would be a victory for them. David remembered all the pain and bitterness he'd ever known, and how much he could remember in such a short time. He recalled, too, all the good things he'd learned since he'd gained his freedom, beauty and laughter, music and kind people, Maria and a tree smothered in pink blossom, a dog to walk by his side, and a place to aim for. This would be the end. He pressed his face into the dog's long coat so that no one should hear him, and wept. He wept quite quietly, but the dog grew uneasy and wanted to whimper again. David stopped crying. God, he whispered, God of the green pastures and still waters, I've one promise of help left, but it's too late now. You can't do anything about this. I don't mean to be rude, because I know you're very strong and you could make those men down there want to walk away for a bit. But they won't. They don't know you see. They're not afraid of you, but they're afraid of the commandant because he'll have them shot if they leave their posts. So you can see there's nothing you can do now. But please don't think I'm blaming you. It was my own fault for not seeing the danger in time. I shall run. Perhaps you'll see they aim straight so it doesn't hurt before I die. I'm so frightened of things that hurt. No, I forgot. I've only got one promise of help left, and it's important you should help the dog get away and find some good people to live with. Perhaps they'll shoot straight anyway, and if the dog... But if they don't, it can't be helped. You must save the dog because it once tried to protect me. Thank you for having been my God. I'm glad I chose you, and now I must run, for if I leave it any longer, I shan't have the courage to die. I am David. Amen. The dog kept nudging him. It wanted them to go back to where they'd come, away from the spot where it sensed danger lurking. No, David whispered. We can't go back. It's too late. You must keep still, King, and when they've hit me, perhaps you can get away by yourself. The dog licked his cheek eagerly, impatiently nudging him again, and moving restlessly as if it wanted to get up. It nudged him once more, and then jumped up before David could stop it. In one swift second, David understood what the dog wanted. It did not want to run back the way that it had come. It was a sheepdog, and it had sensed danger. It was going to take David's place. Barking loudly, it sprang towards the men in the dark. Run! Something inside told David, run, run! And that was what the dog wanted him to do. And so he ran. He hesitated for a moment and then ran more quickly than he'd ever run in his whole life. As he ran, he heard the men shouting and running too, but in a different direction, and one of them yelled with pain. And then came the sound of a shot and a strange loud bark from the dog. David knew that the dog had been killed. He went on running. He was some distance away now, and they'd not hurt him, but he ran on until he'd left far behind the field where they'd left the road an hour before, and then he threw himself down in a ditch, sobbing and gasping painfully for breath. He felt as if he would never be able to stop crying. Never. God of the pastures and waters, so strong that he could influence a person's thoughts, had let the dog run forwards, although he knew it was going to be shot. Oh, you shouldn't have done it, David sobbed again and again. The dog followed me, and I was never able to look after it properly. I couldn't even give it enough to eat, and it had to steal to get food. The dog came with me of its own free will, and then I had to die, just because of... But then David realised he was wrong. It was not because it had followed him that the dog was dead. The dog had gone with him freely, and it had met its death freely in order to protect David from them. It was a sheepdog, and it knew what it was doing. It had shown David what it wanted him to do, and then it had diverted the danger from him and faced it itself because it wanted to. Its very bark as it sprang forward had seemed to say, "Run, run!" And all the time David was running, he had known that he must not turn back and try and save it. He must not let the dog's action be in vain. He had to accept it, so one could get something for nothing after all. David stood in the big city and looked around him. On shop signs and posters were words not altogether unfamiliar, and by the language was quite strange. Denmark, he told himself. I'm in Denmark. He scarcely knew how he came to be there. Since the morning he'd woken up with the knowledge that the dog had died for him, he felt as if nothing had really penetrated his thoughts. He'd got lifts most of the way, and the drivers had shared their food with him. They were all concerned about him and remarked how ill he looked. He had felt better sitting in a lorry, and all the time he was walking he thought he could see the dog running along just in front of him, although he knew it couldn't be true. And he'd come to Denmark. He'd come straight across the frontier. He'd been travelling in a big lorry, and the driver had stowed him away inside. It was against the law, but the driver said that he had boys of his own at home, and he couldn't bring himself to hand David over to the customs officer in the state he was in. The officers would have been kind enough to him, the driver said, but there would have been no end of paperwork to go through, and what David needed was to get to the family that he spoke about as quickly as possible and get to a good warm bed. In a town called Colding, the lorry driver had got hold of a friend who, he said, would take David on to Copenhagen. David had begun to pick a little of the language, and the two men said something about passport or no passport, a bit like a lad like him can't have anything serious against him, and you can see with half an eye he can't hold on much longer. They'd met several Danish lorry drivers in Germany, all quiet men with little to say, and they'd all been kind to him. David had watched the countryside passing by. There were no mountains, no big rivers. Everything was small and compact, but bright and cheerful too. The houses, the people, the woods, everything. David had never imagined woods could look new like these. They're coloured bright and delicate like sunshine on one of Maria's dresses. There was beauty in Denmark too, only a different kind, but all the time he felt too tired to look at it properly. He'd been on a ship too. The driver bought him a ticket so that he didn't have to hide, and when they came to the big city called Copenhagen, David tried to pull himself together. The driver said that if David could just give him the address, he would put him down at the right place. But he could not, of course. He'd told the driver in his bundle at the back of the lorry it was not the truth. If the man realised he had no address to go to, he would be suspicious. This was a free country, but you couldn't be too careful. If they found a strange boy with nowhere to go, they might consider it with their duty to hand him over to them, especially if he were not Danish. The one thing only David had in his head during all the days that had passed since the dog's death, he must reach the woman in Denmark. If he should turn out that the dog had given his life for him and for no purpose, it would be too dreadful to think about, as if the dog's sacrifice had been despised, and that must never be. David had watched the driver make a telephone call. He'd gone into the little glassed-in box affair, and there were books where you could find the numbers you wanted to ring and people's addresses. You only had to slip away whilst the driver was not looking and find another telephone kiosk. They pulled up on a large square, and the driver said something to him which David pretended not to understand. The man was going to buy what he called a hot dog to give to him. As soon as he left the lorry, David dropped to the ground on the other side. There were crowds of people, and it was easy enough to hide amongst them. It was not polite when the driver had been so kind to him, but there was no other way out. David felt certain that he should very soon come to the end of his strength, and before it happened, he must try and find the woman. He ran along street after street, turning corners all the time, until he felt safe. He had no difficulty in finding a telephone kiosk, and there were the directories all in order. He found 6 people called Heorth Fengel, but there was only one with an E in front of the name. The address was Strandvägen 758. It must be a long street, and David decided to ask how to get to it. There were many people who could understand you if you spoke English. He stood there for a moment or two with the book in his hand and looked about him, but before he could make up his mind who to ask, a woman spoke to him. She asked him if she could help him in any way. David answered politely in English, and she understood what he said. She told him the address was a very long way off, and she looked at him and said, "But I'm going that way myself. I can take you most of the way in the car." She asked him what country he came from, and David told her that he was French, since he could not very well say that he came from nowhere at all. Then she seemed to realise he was tired, for after that he said very little, and David sat looking out of the window. Soon they came to the sea, and David thought it was almost as blue as it was in Italy, where he had lived on the rocks. That seemed a very long time ago. David stood for a long time looking at number 758. Everything smelt fresh and pleasant, and there were trees everywhere with white and yellow and lilac blossom. The sun was shining. The leaves were bright and green, and the sea a deep blue. Denmark was beautiful, too. Perhaps all countries were beautiful, where they weren't. A few yards would take him to the door, and yet David thought he would never get there. His legs could carry him no further, and he was on the point of collapsing. He had thought for some time that perhaps if the woman who lived there would tell him what to do and where to go, and he would be able to manage, but now he knew he couldn't. If his happiest dreams came true, he could go on living. If not, this was the end. French was the language he spoke best. David picked up his bundle, walked to the door and rang the bell. When the woman opened it, he knew she was the woman in the photograph. the woman whose eyes had seen so much and yet could smile. Then David said in French, "Madame, I'm David. He could say no more. The woman looked into his face and said clearly and distinctly, "David, my son, David." And there we are. I hope you really enjoyed that book. And I just wanted to say, I'm so glad we've read this to you. After all we learnt last term on World War II, and actually today it's extremely fitting because today is actually Holocaust Remembrance Day. And so finishing our book with David finally getting home is such a wonderful way to finish the day and to remind ourselves of what people went through in that World War for us all. So thank you for listening. I'm sorry if you heard a few dog noises in the background because that's my old grumpy one in the back having a bit of a moan because I'm not playing with him. But thank you for listening to this. We will carry on with another story tomorrow. We'll start a new book. But let us know what you think. Did you enjoy I Am David? It's quite a hard book to listen to, but well done if you listened all the way. And we've really enjoyed reading to you. So we'll start a new book tomorrow. But let's just say and think about Holocaust Memorial Day today and remember how lucky we are